Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man whose blood holds DNA, a tiny spiral of genetic code, abracadabra.
Tim Longo. Wow.
Yep.
Yeah, you had to look that one up. That's not in the game, right?
It is in the game. No, that was a quote I found at one point. It was, I think it was one of those things you push on a wall somewhere. It's like,
yeah.
Push the button and it's like, here's a little clip, from the movie. So,
right.
Yeah.
Well
Abracadabra.
Yeah. Oh,
so,
boy.
We'll talk about the magic of this game. So short podcast, I guess.
Well, so you've played. It's not letting me. Okay, you've played more, and
I have played more.
I'm sure the game is continuing to be weird and like, why are we playing this game or anything from? I don't know. It's just it's a hard. As I played beyond where you played as well too, and there's some of the kind of memorable moments that I recall from the past in the sections coming for you. But it's just I'm still sort of scrutinizing I don't know if it's even fair to call it love for the game, but just infatuation or just befuddlement. I don't know what it is. It's just like because I wrote down a note, and this was, I think, probably in the level that you had played last. But just the general sense of it's still, if I put it in its time as best as I can, there's still moments of it being an impressive feat, even if it's just an attempt that failed.
Yeah.
It's just so weird, though. There's just very, very little like it.
Yeah, I mean, I can see, if I squint really, really hard. Now, I will say a couple things that did help, or one thing that helped is I was able to up the resolution significantly. I think I'm at my native screen resolution now, so
wow, that's nice.
Yeah, because it's on the 3D renderer, the DirectX backwards compatible mode or whatever, but it goes up to 1080p, maybe beyond, but at least is supporting that. So that actually is kind of nice. And that has helped a bit, although things like draw distances are still pretty short. So it's still pretty blurry and weird. Plants are often just like floating, or submerged or whatever. And it's like, well, were they, because at this time, some games were still fixed point rendering, which means, rather than floating point numbers, where you move the decimal, you only have so much precision, but you can represent a larger range of, values. Just you lose low, you lose higher, low, information. So you basically you can have anything from 0.0000001, to, 1 with, 12 zeros after it or whatever. But you only get like 6 digits, 7 digits of actual precision. This one feels like a fixed point game where it's like, well, everything has the same resolution. So you can express the same resolution everywhere, but it's basically an integer value. It's like it's every unit is 3 centimeters, say, or whatever, and you can always precisely represent 3 centimeters, but you can't represent anything in between 0 and 3, 3 and 6, 6 and 9, etc. For example,
interesting.
And I'm not sure. Like Unreal originally was a fixed point engine, which the math is really tricky, but you can make it work. And integer math is really, really fast. Floating point math is, at the time, considerably slower. So even multiplies, I think, were slower. So like adds and multiplies for integers were one cycle, right? And adds and multiplies for floating point were not. Add might have been, but multiply I don't think was. Divide certainly weren't. So anyway, so some people, so typically you would, and I think the original PlayStation was this way as well. Don't quote me on that because I did not error code for that device, but that's my recollection as well.
So when you're watching the rendering happen, explain to me again what are some clues
when I
that
see
are telling you it might be fixed point when
Yeah,
LODs are popping in so discreetly or something?
No, it's not so much LODs, because that's, I'm sure, just a clipping distance, and it's whatever, and you start seeing things in. It's more when I see placement of plants that can't align with the ground.
Yeah.
I think, oh, that's because it can only be at an integer position, whatever that is, right? Some integer, some multiple of an integer, for example. It's just what it feels like to me. Like, that's the sort of error you might see. You typically see, you would see things in the animation. I'm not really seeing it in how the arm moves, but I'm not sure. I mean, it really it's so hard to tell. Because I wouldn't think they would get anything from hardware acceleration if it were a fixed point engine either. So it's like, well, probably not then. But at the same time, well, then those are just really obvious and easy to fix bugs. Where you're just like, okay, so that, you said they needed another year, and it might be across all, possible avenues that they needed more time. Even just object placement in the world, which, granted, not a trivial problem. There might be other things going on as well. Like, I don't know what this patch has done to this game to make it run, GPU accelerated either. So there's a lot of factors at play at this point to really know. But it's just when you see things like that, you're just like, what is causing this? Was this bad authoring? Was this something that happened as a result of, patching later, or conversion to GPU, or, where did these errors come from? Or were they just mild and that you couldn't really tell originally? The higher resolution makes them more obvious. There's a million potential causes for issues like that, but they're very distracting when I play.
I see. I mean, I have a lot of them myself, so I'm still low resolution. I haven't been able, because of the wonky way that I'm getting the game to run. I can't actually fool with the video settings, I don't think, confidently. So I'm playing default, resolution and software. So there's no hardware acceleration going on. So, but as far as like placement of the plants and things like that, it's just a mess. I mean, there's things floating all over the place, and then they float from a distance, and then when the LOD pops in, the LODs are really rough as well. And I didn't remember. Do you experience that too in hardware?
I do. Yeah.
Okay.
Because it's unrelated. I mean, that's purely just when you're this far away, load in the next. And they don't.
So it's just
since they don't have a setting for it. Yeah, they're very tight, and they don't have a setting for it. So you're just kind of like stuck with it, and there's nothing a patch can do about that. Well, it would be difficult for a patch to do much with that.
Yeah. So
I also see bad backface culling as well, for example. So cases where a triangle is not technically facing away from me all the way on the screen, but it's close enough, and it will just not render that triangle, and I'll see through to the clear color, which is a light blue like the sky, right? So so I will see that too. Sometimes in places where I'm like, oh, I see there, and that was actually the other thing that made me think maybe a fixed point renderer was, because that's the sort of like, oh, I'm just this much off from whatever, this degree, that I can't represent. So I've, for performance reasons, I've, it rounds to this value, and therefore, whatever. So it's things like that just make me go, oh, well, that might be an artifact of how the renderer was built. But it could have been let's be aggressive in what polygons we don't render. So I mean, it's just really, it's a strange game.
I think, and I think it's buggy as well. I think, to your point about like just their approach to all of the rendering side of things, you know, the the story goes that they made, because they had made that deal with AMD at the time, and it was sort of like before people had played it, my memory of it was that they were one of the PR beats for this game was very much like trying to be cutting edge, with rendering a world and GP, hardware acceleration was obviously getting big at that time. AMD was maybe looking for a trying to get a foothold because of Voodoo and all that kind of stuff happening at the time. Okay. I don't know who knows what was going on, but
it would make sense then. It's a floating point engine, and these are just bugs.
Yeah. But it was such a highly experimental situation. I don't know if the physics was part of that too. The interesting thing, so you haven't gotten to some of the levels where there's a lot of interactions with buildings like town, the lab, and things like that.
Yeah, so far I've only found one house that I kind of went in and went upstairs in, and there were, which was, it was cool to see something a little more human scale that wasn't just like an overturned Jeep. It was nice to be able to go into a space and have it have multiple floors and obvious rooms and doors and whatever. It's just like, oh, okay. Their doors swing both ways, so that's how they solve the door problem. And I don't remember if the door was locked. I feel like the door might have been locked, and I might have did I have to shoot the lockout? Is that a thing? Probably
maybe?
not, huh?
Yeah, maybe. No, there might have been at least one of those.
Okay.
It's not as common. There's another door thing coming up that we'll probably talk about next time, but
okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's sort of a segue to what I was getting at with the building stuff and the rendering and just like the cutting edge aspect, because the game changes quite a bit when there's buildings for me. And I think some of it is just how obviously your understanding of the spaces changes, because you're now, like you said, you're in a human scale, kind of a human rather than just kind of rolling hills and things. But the physics side of it, like I wanted to ask you for this era, because everything in the game, technically almost everything, like I guess the bushes maybe wouldn't be, but even I think like the trucks and the Jeeps and stuff are movable if you have enough of the ability in most cases. In fact, there's a moment coming up where you could shoot a truck and have it fall on top of a dinosaur kind of thing.
Oh,
and it was placed specifically for that to happen. You don't have to do it, right? And it's completely physics based. It could probably miss. I think it'd be hard to miss, but you could probably mess it up if you shot the truck at the wrong place. But I guess with the buildings, like the wonkiness that comes in, that I also remember kind of mentally, making a mental note, even back in the day, of there's something off about being in buildings. And I wasn't sure if it was because everything is trying to be physics simulated, that like when you're, I don't know, like when you're walking on an upper floor or when you're walking on like a bridge or something, I don't know, it just feels off versus like walking on the terrain. And are they somehow initializing the buildings in a different physics way? Because the doors, obviously, I guess they're probably just all placed in a very discrete, like you said, position, and then they're hinged or whatever, or they're rotating on their hinge. But yeah, everything is just a little bit off. And
yeah,
weird.
I mean, my guess is like that the terrain is a different sort of collider, basically. Like it's an impenetrable collider with no elasticism, right? So there's no elastic collisions with it. An elastic collision versus an inelastic collision. The classic inelastic collision example is like billiard balls, right? They perfectly, more or less, exchange force, right? There's a complete transfer of momentum, or there's a transfer and reflection momentum, whatever. One ball, if one ball stops, the other continues with exactly the same speed, right? And they slow down when they due to movement across the floor and hitting the sides. more or less. There's some loss, but it's that's kind of the classic example. And then something else would be more like sliding. When you put your foot down on something soft, it even just a shag carpet, like you sink in a little bit, like, and you lose some, like you do a little more work to push off, right? And I feel like typically you treat the ground as like a hard stop, like you can't go through the ground, and so you push, and because it's not going to yield at all, it's just like there's a function, exactly what point you can be at, and it puts you at that point and stops you. But when you're talking about the rest of the world, which is all just models, it's more of like, we're going to get you closer and closer and closer. And which is typically a thing that happens, is like, well, okay, because whenever you exert a force on something, that thing is also exerting a force on you. Like we're pushing against, we're standing on you put your hand on a table, the table's also pushing back on you, right? That's equilibrium. There has to be a force up to prevent your force pushing down from penetrating, right? So there's this force going in both directions. And that is sometimes represented in the physics engine, and that makes those interactions feel really weird because, first of all, it is floating point math. It's not infinite. That it doesn't perfectly represent, so there's error, and there's also, just from a performance standpoint, like you might interpenetrate in your initial step, your physics step of like, okay, well, this is moving down, this other thing isn't moving at all, this thing moves this much, okay, that's an interpenetration, how do we resolve that? Well, I don't know how they implemented their physics engine, but sometimes that's like, okay, well, what would happen if we only went halfway? What would happen if we went a quarter of the way? And they can only do so many of those before they say, that's too many, we got to stop, and wherever you are now is good. And of course, physics engines have gotten better in how to resolve these issues. But there was no physics middleware at the time. Everybody's writing their own physics. It was very simplistic. It was all in inelastic collisions, generally speaking, as I said before. I would not be surprised if they're doing both more complicated physics and having this simulation cost that they can't go over. So they have to kind of cut it off at a certain point. And so it's always going to feel a little weird when you're interacting with a physics model that you're standing on, like a house, or a board or a crate or a monorail section, versus the ground, which is like, no, that's a hard stop. Like, we can mathematically say exactly where it is because it's a separate thing. It's like a hard limit of the world. It is a guess, like I'm thinking back to then, like, how would I have done it? Well, naively, you do a thing and then you say, okay, well, the ground's a special case because we can exactly ask, because we have a height field. We know exactly what the height is here, and we just stop you there. And we can just, put the base of the box on that spot. Yeah. But when you're talking about two objects, it's each object is pushing on each other, and it's always, physics was very fussy for a very long time. Things would never settle. They still might not. If you don't set it up right. So yeah, it's a whole thing.
Yeah. I think that does describe that, whether it's happening exactly like that or not, it does describe the feeling that I'm trying to get at, because, and again, not, coming from a designer and level designer's perspective, I'm not the one that understands how, especially collision is always working. And of course, in the old days, having to build the collision, or sometimes the collision is, as we've talked about with some of the older games we've played, the collision is represented more discreetly by the polygons you see versus like having a separate collision, geometry, so to speak. So I'd be really interested to know how collision's working for them. But there's something, I think you'll know what I mean when you get to when you get to the town, because it's, most of the gameplay is just in and amongst, those buildings, right? Different shapes and sizes and levels. And there's just something weird about it, especially when you're trying to interact with some of the smaller physics objects, which are meant to be, kind of the core, for better or for worse, some of the core gameplay of the game. But But yeah, it's like the buildings, to your point, like there's the terrain, and then there's the buildings, and then there's the boxes and planks and things, right? And the buildings are like living in their own weird world. Like, for instance, almost every building, like, I'm wondering if they did this on purpose, but it's an example of what I mean. Like, almost every building, the doorways have like a door jamb on the bottom of the door opening versus just meeting the terrain. And I'm kind of wondering, like, I have these weird theories where they had to build these buildings like in a discrete large object, and you're inside a large object in a way. But I'm sure that the things would freak out if that were actually the case. But long story short, what I was trying to get at is really
then you would be interpenetrating and you'd shoot off into the sky, right? That's that's the typical, response, is like you overcorrect for the interpenetration of two objects, and what results, because that's an infinite force, right? You can't be here. So it generates this force that is, way out of whack, instead of just kind of pushing you up a little, which is, how things have adjusted.
Right. And that's why I brought up bridges, some of the bridges, and then there's, you'll get to some piers, later, a wharf kind of pier area. And those piers are not geometry, and they're not buildings. They seem like objects or something. And then when you walk upon them, she kind of acts in a weird manner. And it's reminiscent of those sorts of problems where you have these really large physics objects that probably shouldn't be doing what they're doing. It's usually designers, as you would say, breaking, using the game in a way it's not meant to be used, but we're trying to be creative, and we're
trying to build a wharf.
Yeah, exactly. Like, well, hey, can we build a wharf? Yeah, just build a bunch of planks together like a real wharf, and then you just walk across those. That would work, right? And the programmers are going, no, don't do that, you idiot. That's not how we build. Just make one big object. So I don't know what's happening there, but long story short, like, the thing that I love about this game is it feels like this era, and I guess we still do these to some degree now, but this era was definitely the era of tech demos. Like, every platform usually shipped with a tech demo, and listeners will remember some of them. There's some really kind of funny and infamous ones at some, like, PlayStation 2 and
the rubber duck one, and
and then video card companies would do tech demos, and everybody would do a tech demo of some kind because they wanted to show off, and it was good to sell their product. But there's so much of this game that feels like a tech demo that got a budget or something, or a tech demo that got a budget and an IP. And they're like, let's go for it. I wonder, like, and maybe this is out. Maybe, I don't know, maybe NoClip did something on this game at some point. I'd be surprised, but somebody might have. But the genesis of this game, whether they even had the license first or whether the license came later, but were there some tech demos out there that people were like, oh, there's something here that we could go further with, right? And then which, chicken or the egg, which one came first? But later, as you get through some of the other levels, there's definitely some areas where they're starting to push probably further than they should on how to use the physics engine to be the core gameplay of the game. And, because it feels so tech demo-y, the concept of using this physics as your core gameplay is very problematic, right? It's very challenging because it's unpredictable. It's not real. It's not what I'm being too designery here, but it's not what I would even call gameplay. But it's what they are. It's what they've chosen to rest on. Yeah, it's what they have, and it's what they've promoted. Right? It's like, this is going to be a game where I stack boxes to make a stairway so I can get up to the second level, and you'll know exactly.
The problem is stacking.
Yeah. Well, okay.
I already had one of those, right? There was this place where there was, and it's not a big step, right? It's, I only actually needed one box to get up to the second thing, but I wanted to try to create, it was a case where, it's clearly set up like, use your gun. Here's the puzzle. You've got to figure out to get those boxes off of that really big box. So there's like a really tall box with some smaller boxes on top. and you have to use your gun, or I had to use my gun. Maybe there are other ways to do this. I did try throwing rocks up there, and I could not aim them well enough to hit the boxes on top.
I killed a raptor with a rock. I dropped
wow.
a rock on top of him. Yeah.
Wow.
It's possible.
I did not. Well, this was, I was just trying to get these boxes down. So I was shooting the boxes, and I'm like, this would destroy a box, first of all, if I do this with an actual box. But okay, so I shot, I got a few boxes down. I brought them over. I could not get them to stay in place. And I know that it's coming, that I'm going to have to do that. I've tried to do it in several places already in this game and been like, well, thank goodness I can use my arm as a lever to push myself over this edge. I imagine the actual, what a third person view of this would look like. And it's like a person walks up to these things and like tries and finally gives up and just kind of like puts their arm on top of the box and then pushes forward and tries to hop at the same time so that they're kind of landing on their arm and getting getting just enough, momentum from that collision to push them on top of the box and then over to the next side. And that's what it looks like, for a mini driver to be playing this game.
It's like trying to climb a mountain while you're in a cauldron.
Exactly.
It's like, it's so nonsense.
It is. It's very GURP or, QWOP or whatever, where you're like trying to independently control the limbs of something. Or trying to do that. Yeah.
So there's one particular section is it in the town? Yes, it's in the town. So you're going to get there soon. That I won't spoil too much, but it is what you're saying, and it's critical path, and that's what makes it even worse. I probably spent over an hour on this one thing.
Oh God!
And the problem is because physics are unpredictable, right, and they're unreliable, like you said, and they're trying to do things that really weren't done very often, like stacking multiple things on top of each other and then using them with your character. Like, I'm really interested. I mean, can we assume that the collision for the character is a pill? I mean,
it's not. It's a box.
It's not. Yeah, okay, that explains stairs. So there's a lot more stairs coming up from you too, and you go to the stairs. You bottom. You hit any stair. You hit if you hit it directly the way you would normal life. You just will stop. Exactly. So you have to angle up a little bit and then kind of like look up at the sky and kind of, well, you don't have to hop it, but you definitely can feel a box moving over stairs as you're pushing yourself up.
I felt that getting up in the end of I guess it was in the middle of the third level. After I'd gotten through the canyon, there's a section where you have to climb up to this like really nice vista, once you get there. But getting there, I had at that point, I had worked out that I could stow a gun and then have a second gun. So it's basically Halo. Yeah. At this point. It's like, I have two guns and I can swap them by dropping this one and the other one and then picking one up and stowing it. Actually, no, I think you can swap them. I think you can literally swap them with just the stow. So you like put away a gun, take out a gun, or however that works.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, you just
okay. Uh-huh. You just swap that way. So
you just hit really that again, and it'll.
It really is Halo. So you and what's his name? Was the Xbox guy. So the DirectX evangelist.
Seamus.
Seamus Blackley. Yeah. So I got to that point, and I'm feeling the physics of getting up these weird. They're not steps, but they're very similar to steps. And there was a point at which, like, I have my AK or whatever it is in my hand because I want to have the two weapons, and I'm like trying to get up into a space that I actually don't think I can. Like in retrospect, because I think there might be a boundary even there, but it let my gun go there. And I'm like, well, no way am I leaving that gun behind. I worked so hard to get that gun, so I'm just like fighting just to get up enough to maybe pick it up at the same time. And it's like, I'm spending all this time just to sort of get close enough to be able to do this weird thing with this appendage that I have, this robot appendage, which is supposed to be my arm, to get it just close enough that I can grab it. And then not only to hold on to it, because I know what's going to happen is as soon as I start moving, it's going to like snag the ground and get pulled out of my hand, which is also super frustrating. But then like hope that it will fall closer to me as a result so that I can actually pick it up and try to go a different direction. So that was that whole climb. It was often like putting my arm out and jumping and using my arm as that lever. I mean, I'm actually pretty good at getting up those stairs, but then having the gun and having to constantly remember, okay, but turn around and pick up your gun because you probably dropped it doing that.
Oh, just wait. So
good.
Well, so yeah, when you get to the town areas, you'll know why. I mean, definitely save often, because I'll just say there are objects you have to carry.
Oh, good.
That are small and critical path.
Oh, God.
So same problem, right? Like you can just swing your arm around and hit a door frame accidentally, and then that thing is just going to go flying.
Oh,
because you just hit it at the right. So luckily they're brightly colored, so you'll be able to find them. You might be able to guess at what they are. But anyway, it's a trope.
I know DNA.
No, I won't. You'll get there soon. But what was I going to say? So that I wanted to ask you about the collision for the character, because if it is a box, which sounds so ridiculous for this kind of game, it also.
Yeah, I was discussing this game with a coworker today who was asking what we're playing,
really?
and he, he's an engineer, and he went and he had never heard of the game. I said, well, that's not surprising.
Yeah.
It's been discontinued since you were very young. So it wouldn't have been easy for you to find, and it probably wasn't translated into your native language. And he was looking it up, and he's like, my God, they used the box for the physics collision for the body. And he said, wouldn't a sphere be cheaper? And I was like, yeah, but then they'd have other problems. Like it would be impossible to get upstairs.
Yeah.
So
it explains a lot, even jumping onto a box, like as yourself, just, that there's this sort of this corner of yourself that you're trying to,
you have to lift this corner over the lip of the box.
And why you seem to feel like, why it feels like you hit sometimes wrong and you just fall down. So that actually is helpful to know for the future, because it's definitely frustrating. But that section, that hour-long section of just trying to get to the second floor. So I apologize now. Maybe you get lucky. Sometimes what this happens to the two of us, like you end up doing it in the first try and it's fine. The problem is there's some puzzly stuff where you might have to jump back down and do it again. So anyway, good luck. But the segue there, which you kind of brought into the picture, because it sounds like you're using the arm for weird unintended purposes to help yourself.
Yeah,
I do want to talk about the arm, because I mean, we joke about the ridiculous aspect of, having a gun in your hand. First of all, you're holding it with a straight arm. Second of all, you can't change its trajectory at all. So you're going to, when you're moving around, you're going to slam it into things. It has physics itself. So when you turn, it drags, right? So it kind of catches up to you, like they're trying to simulate, I guess, real body physics. Who knows? But the funny thing about it that I got this last session, I had this weird memory from playing it before that happened to me probably around the same time it happened this time. There are very few games in the world, I feel like, where you have to have a sense of your body.
Proprioception, right?
Is that okay? Is that I knew there was a term for that. Yeah. And so, and I think the reason that it happened around the same place is because it was in the town for me too, because you're going in and out of doorways so much. And there's this new sort of sensibility that you don't get with a lot of games that I think is super fascinating. And of course, it's very clunky and you wouldn't ever want to do it. You don't want to repeat this unless you have a very specific goal, like climbing mountains in a cauldron or something. But the sense of like holding this gun, because like you just said, the guns are pretty valuable. When you find a really good one, you don't want to lose it. So for me, you enter this new sort of level of body awareness where you're going through. it's like another skill almost, right? Because
Yeah.
you're trying to go through these doors, which are usually only ajar because I've left them that way, or the door has naturally, I've gone through and
It's
then I run
settled
around
that
the
way,
room
yeah.
and then it's settled a little bit, but it's only open a little bit. So I've gotten really good at, snaking through the door with my arm held straight with this huge rifle and not hitting the door or the door frame. So I'm not going to lose my gun. But, it's just something that we take for granted in games where it's like, it's all fake, right? You have a capsule. They don't care about any of this stuff. But this game was striving to simulate everything as perfectly as it could. So tell me more about how much do you use the arm? Because I don't know if you know.
I
but,
use it all the time when I'm climbing.
You can
always.
You can rotate your wrist. You
can rotate it. Yeah.
And you can also, rotate your wrist in, I don't know, I'll say X and Y, or something.
Yeah, no, I read about that. No, did I read about that? I feel like I read about that in the manual when I started.
Yeah. Where you see the key, there's key inputs for it. So you're like, well, I must fool with that. Yeah.
Yeah, that too. It wasn't because of the key inputs. It was because I read it, but, I remember going, wow, that's an interesting choice.
Well, it might come into play with picking up boxes and stacking them. I'll say that.
I kind of figured that you could kind of tilt it and tip it onto the box, but it was I discovered that it was, even that was so frustrating and turned out not to be necessary, that I was just like, well, I'll stow that away. So I like my second gun. So I kind of had figured out something like that. It reminds me a lot of, basically how the body is modeled reminds me a lot of early sort of physics crossed with machine learning techniques. So to try to procedurally animate things. For example, they used to do this thing where what's the learning technique? It'll come to me. It's some kind of evolution. But it's like you were trying to evolve a solution to the problem. And so you'd start, it's like you want to simulate locomotion. So you're like, okay, well, you're allowed boxes and joints, just rotator joints. The first ones were done in 2D, but I can imagine the 3D version of this. And you'd come up with things that would actually would work. They were terrifying to behold. You're like, oh my God, if I ever saw a creature that worked that way, it would be so odd. So you'd see a fat block with a short little arm sticking out, and that arm would the shoulder was just enough off the ground that it could kind of mantle itself up and forward a little bit and then drop. It would learn to do that. It's
like a crazy monster.
Right. And it was just like a crazy monster. And in fact, I'm now thinking of, there was a clip, actually it was in the documentary, In the Kingdom of Dreams and Madness or something like that. It's about Hayao Miyazaki, who was retiring at the time, although he's since come back with another movie. But I think he was finishing The Wind Rises, and this documentary was done at the same time. And maybe it was a clip online, but they basically these people who were doing research into procedural animation showed him a model where they a human body learned to move itself. And because it was a model, he was pointing out okay, this is an object that has no sense of pain, and that's why it's just, and it doesn't know to protect its head, and that's why it's using its head to move. And he's like, this is, and he was basically saying, this is abominable. You should feel really bad about yourselves. And I think he ended the whole clip by saying something like, I think the Earth is going to end soon. And it's this is the same sort of thing where you're like, wow,
that's so meta. It goes back to what we said last episode. It's the literal Jurassic Park quote, right? Yep. They're so
Yep. So
Worried
focused
about
on
whether
whether
they
they could
could.
do the thing. Yep.
They didn't think about whether they should. Yeah. And this game, it's like, it's too meta. I'm actually, it's breaking my brain right now. Not just the Miyazaki example, but the fact that quote applies so much to making dinosaurs
Yeah.
in the movie. And then also this game, like, should you make this game? Like, well, no, it's just, can we do it? Yeah. Can we make a fully physics simulated? Can I have an arm? The other thing about the arm, though, for me is that, so you're using it in additionally weird ways because it's like it's a tool for you. It sounds like,
yeah.
Which, but also being an FPS fan, and we've played many of them on the podcast. But the I don't know why I had forgotten about this until we started to play again. But because you have so much control, more control over your arm than any other FPS of its kind. And because, I don't know, obviously we don't know how the weapons themselves are tuned, but let's assume they're fairly discreetly tuned based on the axis of the barrel or whatever. Or, where the raycasts are coming from the tip of the gun. But they're using, the crosshairs are modeled, the guns are modeled fairly accurately for this game. And I love the fact that when I pick up a gun, I can situate my arm and put it in a specific location that I'm comfortable with, for, I don't know, my own FPS brain. But then also I can rotate the wrist and arm to have the back crosshair and the front crosshair actually line up and see that in a very discrete manner. Now, from an accuracy standpoint, to shoot a dinosaur, you probably don't need to do that. But every time I pick up a gun, I do it because I can. You know what I mean? Because it's like, there's no other game that lets me. Now, it's so clunky. It's terrible. It's really terrible. Like the fact that I have to do this. But the more you do it, the more that there's this weird satisfaction that it kind of comes back to that body awareness thing of like, I pick up a gun and I line up my crosshairs. Now, in most games, that is done for you. You just press one button, the left trigger, and you do that. It's like, but here it's like, no, you got to actually rotate your wrist, with this axis and this axis, and then move your arm around. You can move your head separately from your arm, so you can really get it out of whack. But it's like every time I pick up a gun, I'm just trying to like recreate Halo, in that point. But I have complete control myself.
I do it a different way.
Novel. Oh no. Yeah.
I pick up a new gun. I save the game. Then I kind of I just kind of use the, I guess, what is it, shift and click or whatever, to just kind of put the gun in a place where like it's not obscuring too much of the screen. It's vaguely facing forward. And then I turn around until I can see like a tree or something. And I figure out where I think I'm going to hit. I shoot the gun. I see where I actually hit. And I go, oh, okay, that's the offset. And then I reload.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you actually have thought this through quite a bit.
So I actually...
From a very logical perspective. And
I'm just like, okay, like I'm going to be this much off. Like I'm just going to correct, like you would correct for an arrow or something, like it's going to fall this much. I mean, any gun would do this, honestly. Like it's going to fall this much. If you're a sniper, that's something you actually have to care about, right?
That's why they're callers for snipers. Yeah. Like, you 2 degrees.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. You need to know, and you have instrumentation on the gun that helps you with it, etc. And wind speed matters, and like, the further you have to shoot a bullet, the more these things come into play because physics, gravity, wind speed, friction, air friction. So I just do that, and I'm like, oh, okay, I just have to correct this much for the gun. I just have to.
Yeah, that's
I have to aim up and to the left a little bit, or back and to the right, back and to the right.
I know, I knew that was coming, especially with some of the. I don't know if you've seen some of the recent news about that.
I have not actually. So I blissfully was away watching a lot of movies this weekend. So
yes, good for you. Good for you. Yeah. Some doctor surfaced with some supposed new information, but
here we go.
Nonsense.
Probably.
Yeah, and Yeah. So that's a really interesting technique. It's a very methodical, logical way to do it, which I probably should have thought of as well. But for me, there's like so that is the discrete like answer to success. I think I'm not even looking for success. I think there's this like gratification I have because I don't know. I'm really overthinking and over talking this, but I'm trying to make the point because there are no other games that do this because you shouldn't do it. You don't need to do it. But the fact that you can in this game cracks me up so much that there's just a weird satisfaction to lining up those crosshairs based on player agency versus, just designers and the team programmers making it work. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just a weird nuance that really means not very much in this day and age. But if I really stretch it some, and because for the podcast we talk about how do the games that we play influence and have a legacy of some kind, and even though the person you mentioned you were talking to today at work didn't even know what this game was, the fact that I don't know, sometimes we've talked about this from time to time. I think sometimes you do need to see the antithesis of something to realize realize what the correct.
I mean, you play this game, you know why we use capsules and not cubes.
Yeah, good point.
Right?
Good point.
Yeah.
Or why you don't need the player to line up your crosshairs.
Yeah, themselves. Right. Yeah, I will also say that in terms of the sort of procedural animation elements, I mean, there are antecedents to this game like Spore, or even. No Man's Sky, both of which have, very healthy procedurally generated, animation systems. And I think it's a lot more controlled in the case of No Man's Sky. There are a lot of constraints, in terms of what the bodies can be like, and, they can sort of make the animation from the, but with Spore, there was like, go ahead and put the creature together however you like. It doesn't even necessarily have to have bilateral symmetry, and
it can use its head to walk. It's okay.
Yeah, they'll have to figure out an animation. And they did that with a lot of like animation blending, and like they didn't do it this way, I guess is my point. But I mean, they may have known, from this example that that trying to solve it this way will probably not work, or will not be believable to players. I mean, it may work in the sense of actually it will locomote the character, but you may look at it and think that's not how that thing should move. Even though in theory, physically, this is better motivated, than the other thing about the physics, though, this cracks me up every time, is that the velociraptors look so sort of loose and like bouncy.
I was just going to mention,
until they're dead, and then they're like they turn off the physics on them. They become logs, basically. Logs with arms. They become cylinders with sticks sticking out of them. They become rigid, right? And now they don't basically kind of jiggle down an incline or something like that. They don't roll and flop, and their legs don't like splay. Like, it's funny because that would actually look more natural. So they're unnatural on both sides of the equation. I'm sure it's because it's actually very expensive to turn them into a bunch of soft bodies, that react naturally and have these constraints, and that's even more computationally expensive, and like you have arbitrary contact points. Like when it's just basically the feet, you don't, it can kind of just like the whole system, it can kind of bounce because you just have these 2 points of contact you have to care about. But when the body can fall, well, now making it a rigid body makes a lot more sense, and treating it like a system of, a couple of boxes or whatever it is. So
it sounds like you saw a good Triceratops encounter with some raptors.
I did, yeah. I saw.
You're seeing some of that stuff happening. There's one coming up for you where, and I'll just a little bit of a spoiler. There's 2 T-Rexes, and they're fighting another. I forget which dinosaur. They're not fighting it. They're hunting it. But then, of course, once they kill that one, then the 2 of them are fighting each other. And so I actually watched the fight to its completion. And T-Rexes are nearly impossible for us to kill. Like you'd have to put a lot of bullets into them. So I wasn't actually sure if they could die. So I was watching this fight happen. But to your point, obviously the animation system makes it very surreal and weird. But there's just a fascination. It's like watching it's like this morbid curiosity of like, what? Because they're not moving naturally. They're not moving logically almost. Well, I guess they're moving logically from a math perspective, but not from like a nature perspective. Because one will hit the other one.
Math doesn't go far enough, right? Honestly, I mean, the issue is that like the joints are probably like hinges with springs, basically. But that's not
what it looks like.
That's not what our joints aren't ideal springs. Right. I mean, their joints in the game are probably what they would call an ideal spring. Like it obeys this very specific law. I mean, because it's not made of real material. An ideal spring is, it's a mathematical construct. Like I was describing earlier with, what was I talking about earlier? I don't know, something else. With the forces, right? And the inelastic collisions. So the same is true, like of our joints. It's like, well, the spring of, say, our, ACL, it's not the same when it's fully extended as when it's not. It's like, the tension changes.
It's not equally distributed.
Right. The behavior is not the same throughout the flex or, or whatever of the joint, and that's true of all of our joints, any of them that have cartilage or whatever in them. And so, and then of course, the ball joints aren't perfect balls. And it's just like, it's just a mess, right? I mean, just biology is a mess. And you try to approximate that with ideal, quote unquote, objects like ideal springs and, simple hinges or even, rotable ball joints. And they look entirely wrong because they extend too fast at the extents. At the point where they should be slowing down, they're not slowing down enough, because of the tension of the skin and the joints and the tendons and
right. That's why. Yeah, that's where you have them.
That's why they look so weird.
They're buckling. Their knees are buckling up from underneath them at certain times. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I bring up this particular fight because it's such an interesting example, and I think you'll probably see the same one. And it takes a while for one to take the other one down. And, they have the simulated blood happen when they get attacked, when they do damage to certain points. And I think it's coming from the actual point of the damage, even when you shoot them. And if you do location-based damage, they have somewhat location-based damage if you shoot them in the legs and stuff. But anyway, these T-Rexes are trying to fight each other fairly ineffectively, but very aggressively and hitting themselves in random. It's like the bite will hit in a range, kind of, wherever the physics happens to hit, and it'll cause the other one to kind of topple and fall on its side, and its feet are like dangling there, and then it kind of manages to get itself up. But the funniest thing about this fight is that, at least in my case, where it ended up happening after they had killed the herbivore, is that there's these 3 trees clustered around the fight. And the biggest enemy to them were the trees.
Yeah.
They were like bouncing off the tree, going in inside, and then they would bite, and then one would like knock the other one over, and they'd be stuck in the trees and trying to get out. It was just the weirdest like tech demo that you'd ever seen. It was like a pachinko. I don't know. I don't even know how to describe it.
It's like watching people in those inflatable costumes.
Exactly.
The sumo costumes you see like at the ballparks. Yeah. I know I don't go to a lot of sporting events, but like in, between innings, especially in like minor league baseball and stuff, they'll have people out there doing all kinds of crazy stuff. They'll be in sumo suits fighting. They'll be running races in, costumes like they're condiments. They'll be in those dinosaur suits fighting. So they'll look like these weird velociraptors, right? Where it's like you can see the human feet at the bottom, and then there's just this big inflated thing, and you can see their face, and their kind of arms are encased. And I can imagine it looks like that because they bounce so weird. Right? They just kind of
there's a person inside the T-Rex costume
trying
who
to push it
doesn't
in the
really
right direction.
know how it works.
Yeah.
They're just like, I'm going to try this, and they're fleeing themselves. It's just a very surreal. But your Miyazaki story resonates with this because, the same thing goes for when you see a raptor come at you. Basically, there's this very creepy, unrealistic feel. Like you said, they kind of lope and bounce, right? They're trying to find their feet, and sometimes they even trip on the ground. They're just trying to get to you, and they're like, "Whoa!" It's just ridiculous. But because just like Miyazaki's revelation about why are you simulating this? It's a similar thing where they're raptors can take you down, especially some of the class 2 ones can take you down pretty quickly. So often,
because red ones, I guess.
Yeah, because I'm shooting directly at them, they get pretty close, but they're so weird as they come at you. It's almost like they're not a dinosaur. There's some weird space creature, but it's very disconcerting or something, or very unsettling to have this. They definitely don't feel like a raptor or a dinosaur. There's actually a line that Attenborough has later on that I don't think you've heard yet, where they talk about T-Rexes and how fast they can run. I thought it was so ironic because these T-Rexes do not run at all. But it's such a funny irony. But I don't know, such a weird game.
One thing I will say, maybe to close it off about the dinosaurs, specifically the T-Rex, is that I guess I've encountered one that was pretty close to me, coming out of the first section of the canyon. So there's kind of a section of the canyon where it's more like a creek bed or something like that, or a dried up bed of some kind. You can't go up the sides very much, but they're not very high either. They're like head height or about that. You come out of that, there's a big tree on the right, and there's a T-Rex and a couple of velociraptors nearby. I think I also saw those fight. The T-Rex owned them in a hurry. And I was like, okay, well, that's good. But I was like, well, I'm just going to stand still here next to this tree. Thinking, the movie said, don't move.
Yeah,
that's not how the game treats the dinosaurs in front. They see you, and if they can see you, they will come at you. It didn't get me or anything. I kept moving back and around back.
The trees are the worst enemies. Yeah.
I basically was using this. It's a really big tree too, so I was like, okay, like a huge baobab kind of tree or something. So I was kind of going and just try to keep its face so it couldn't actually see me. So eventually it kind of which was kind of cool. It was hard for it to turn around. It couldn't back up and just back up and come to the other side of the tree. So it had to turn and kind of go away. But because it's got kind of a big turn radius, it actually had to go kind of a ways away and come back towards me. And I kind of watched that happen once, just because okay. Yeah, exactly. Well, okay, how far does it have to go, and where am I going to go? So that it came back, I did this again, and now I knew, okay, I have this much time to get to the next place I'm going to go. And it didn't see me go there. So it went back to the tree. And that was kind of cool. I was like, that's interesting. So it actually, they were modeling enough about it to have a here's the last place I knew you to be. I made a plan to, normally we would just use pathfinding for this, but this doesn't feel like that. It's more like the pathfinding is just driven by the goal. I have a goal, and I'm just using sensors in the environment to figure out how I'm going to get back to that goal. And it's I had to turn around. If to move away, I have to turn around again. I start my turn. It's I can't complete my turn yet. Keep going straight. I'd love to see the debug draw of how the AI works, of just we're shooting out 2 rays, I can imagine just thinking about how I would do it back in that time of out in front to the left and right to see where where it collides. And it would probably have some sense of its turning speed, and well, I can't turn here because I know the geometry a little bit in this space. It's too close, so I have to turn away first, and like I can almost like visualize that on my own from that one experience. And it was cool that it didn't just like know where I was, that it, you know,
it lost track of you.
People always say, well, I don't want the AI to cheat. And it's like, we were talking with Soren Johnson about that with Civilization. Like, what does that even mean? You know, what is cheating? You know, in this sense, right? And it's like, well, I don't want it to have information I wouldn't have. And this is a perfect example of when you don't, how good things can happen. But also illustrates at the same time, but most of the time you really just want it to know what it's like. You want to manufacture this experience because you want this experience, you want it to be planned for, rather than an accident of the systems, right? You know, it's an emergent behavior of its AI that this happened the way it did, the way I read it, which is cool, but also terrifying to think of building a game that way.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be inconsistent too, but right. You know, but that is a great example and story. I think another example of, you know, you have to squint and it's very blurry, but there's these glimmers in this game where these sorts of things happen that I think are writ large in games like Far Cry later. And, you know, like there's these concepts that if you have these magical moments, all as clunky as they are, like first, you know, just take away the fact, like imagine they're not dinosaurs. Imagine they're just some other alien or something, you know what I mean? And the rules, once it's a little bit like the body awareness thing I was mentioning earlier, once you recontextualize the rules of this game and the world for what it is and not try to make it something that it isn't, I think some magical things can happen because it's just unlike anything else. And I know I'm stretching there, but I still think there's a reason why those few of us who have played this game before and had it stick in our brain for some reason, I think there's a reason for that I've been kind of chasing. And we've mentioned a friend of the podcast, Reed Knight as well, who's a colleague of ours who he and I would talk about this game. We've been talking about it since it came out.
And a TIE fighter tester, so you can go back and find that interview.
He was on the cast, yeah. So there's a reason that we joke and reference it often because it's just this weird sticky thing that, you know, from all the games we've played, it's one of those good bad games, you know, where it's like, yeah, terrible in so many ways, but what you just described there, I had another moment where I don't know what they're doing with the raptors because I was able a couple times to walk by one very slowly and it has a sniffing animation, like it's sniffing you and it didn't see me. So I don't know if there's some other stuff going on there, or maybe I just got lucky and the machine broke down. But yeah, I don't know. There's just, once you kind of digest some of the rules of the game and embrace it for what it is, I think some interesting things can happen. So that was good.
Yeah,
too.
I did have a good spot too at the in that canyon. So after that section I described with the T-Rex, there's a spot with a much steeper canyon. It's even like a cave at one point. So you kind of come out of this cave and then it's all this black rock, I guess, you know, volcanic rock or something like that, and you can climb up out of it, and there's 2 or 3 raptors in there, and then at the top there's a crashed helicopter.
Oh yeah.
And I got up to the top there and I was basically fending them off with very few bullets, but I knew that there was a gun in the helicopter or plane or whatever it was, and I'm like, I shot one of them, but then I was out of bullets. So I climbed up to a spot that I knew they couldn't climb to because they have limits.
Yeah. You
know, and then I was kind of using the gun and sort of pointing at them because they don't want to be in the line of fire of the gun I've seen. Even an unloaded gun, they don't know, apparently. So they do kind of limit their knowledge in different ways. And trying to like wait it out a little bit or just kind of push it back away so I could get back to the helicopter and get the gun so that I would have something for whatever was next, because I didn't know what was next. What was next was just climbing up and falling down a non-existent waterfall into a pool. So there's a lot more climbing in my future, but that was a cool moment too of like, okay, well, I don't know what's ahead of me. I mean, it felt like a real survival moment of like, I'm making taking the calculated risk of trying to get this gun to prepare myself for whatever's coming. And
you're using the rules around you to do it, right?
Yeah,
and they've given enough purpose to those rules to make it actually possible. It's very clunky, and it doesn't always work. But when it does, I still think there's something, pretty interesting there. The two biggest enemies of a raptor are
steep terrain,
a hill, and a tree. Yeah, those are
the two natural enemies of the raptor.
Right, the real predators, the hills.
They're alive. Wow. Yeah, well, it's something. Next week we're going to try to finish the game. I think we're kind of straining to find new topics to discuss a little bit, much as the dinosaurs are striving to climb hills.
If you are able to finish, there are going to be plenty to finish with because of the town and the lab and the ending. Yeah.
I wanted to try to get some time in today, but we had a few meetings and things like that. I just didn't have any time to play any more of levels. But I put in, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours on the two that I played. I'll try to sneak in some time, this weekend into the weekend so I can finish it. I think I can. I believe in myself. But in the meantime, shoot us some email at devgameclub@gmail.com if you have topics or questions to discuss about this game or any other topics you'd like us to talk about. We can also use some reviews. We haven't seen one of those in a while. I get the Apple ones, but if you send it to some other podcasting service, I'd love to hear, and maybe you could point us in this direction or just email it in. You can find us on the web at devgameclub.com, on Twitter at devgameclub, or you could maybe even find him twitching at twitch.tv/
Tim Longo Jr. with the JR at the end. I will return.
You'll return someday. Not this week, maybe next week. We'll see. Probably not next week either, actually, now that I think about it, knowing what your schedule's like for the next few days. But we'll see. You were last playing Arkham Knight. Have you continued?
Yeah. No,
are you going to start something different next time?
Next week might happen, though. Yeah, next week could happen. But I think I'm still going to try to do one, maybe last session of Arkham Knight, and then I'm hoping to go back to Control because I want to play the Alan Wake.
Ah, right.
I want to do the DLC for Control, and then play Alan Wake 2, maybe. Yeah.
Okay, cool. We also have a fan-run Discord, and there's a link for that in the show notes. Our intro and outro music was written and performed by Kirk Hamilton, commissioned by friend of the cast, Aaron Evers, and our logo, that Discord, and our merch store, which you can find a link through the Discord, are by Mark Garcia. Have fun bouncing around in your dinosaur costumes this week, and good night.
Good night.